47 cameras watched the Ashford estate, and at all hours their lenses catching every shadow that moved through marble hallways and across Persian rugs worth more than most people earned in a year. Elena Ashford had installed them herself, or rather had paid technicians $340,000 to install them, according to specifications she'd spent 6 weeks drafting. 18 were visuies to anyone who cared to look up. 29 hid behind smoke detectors inside decorative moldings embedded in electrical outlets that powered nothing but surveillance. She knew the exact angle of every lens, the blind spots that didn't exist because she'd eliminated them with overlapping fields of view, the way her security consultant had taught her before she fired him for suggesting that maybe 47 cameras was excessive for a private residence. That had been 14 months ago, 3 weeks after her mother's funeral, when the world still felt like it was ending in slow motion. Now the cameras were simply how Elena lived. She woke at 6 each morning and reviewed footage from the night before, watching accelerated playback of empty rooms and hallways where nothing happened. She told herself this was prudence. She told Harper, her assistant, that this was simply good household management. She told Dr. Torres during their monthly sessions that she attended only because Harper had threatened to quit if she didn't. That surveillance was the logical response to an unpredictable world. What she didn't tell anyone was that the cameras had become the only company she could tolerate. They asked nothing. They judged nothing. They simply recorded, preserved, documented every moment so that nothing could be lost to the gap between what happened and what people claimed happened. Her mother had died because of such a gap, because a nurse had noticed something wrong and mentioned it to a colleague who promised to check but forgot, because a cough button in the recovery room had malfunctioned, and no one knew Catherine Ashford was choking until the scheduled rounds 40 minutes later. If there had been cameras in that hospital room, if someone had been watching, her mother would still be here. Elena understood that this logic was flawed. Torres had explained it carefully, using the kind of gentle voice reserved for children and trauma patients. But understanding something intellectually and accepting it emotionally were different animals, and Elena had learned that the second one was optional if you had enough money and enough square footage to arrange your life so that acceptance was never required. The new janitor appeared on her monitors at exactly 10:58 p.m. on a Monday in April, 2 minutes early for his first shift. Elena had been reviewing invoices in her study, but the motion alert pulled her attention to the security feed showing the service entrance. He was black, which the employment file from Hampton Staffing Agency had noted in the careful language that wasn't supposed to matter, but always did. 41 years old, clean background check references that praised his attention to detail and quiet reliability. The previous janitor had quit after 6 months, citing exhaustion from the overnight schedule, though Elena suspected the real reason was the cameras. Some people couldn't tolerate being observed. This one, Silas Reeve, according to the file, stepped through the door with the posture of someone who expected nothing and feared nothing. He wore the gray uniform the agency provided, sleeves rolled to his elbows, despite the April chill that settled into the house after midnight. His forearms were a warm brown under the harsh LED security lights. He carried no personal bags, no phone visible in his pockets, no coffee thermos or water bottle, or any of the small comforts most overnight workers brought to make the hours bearable. Just a man in the work ahead of him. Garrett Voss, the night security chief, met him in the service corridor. The camera there had excellent audio, and Elena turned up the volume. Garrett extended a hand, a firm shake, professional, nothing lingering. Then Garrett launched into the orientation that Elena had heard him deliver 11 times in the past 3 years to 11 different cleaning staff. The house rules were simple but absolute: clean. What you're assigned, don't touch valuables, cameras everywhere for security, so work as if you're always being watched, because you are. Most new hires reacted to this information with visible discomfort, a glance upward at the nearest lens, a tightening around the eyes, sometimes nervous laughter to cover the feeling of being trapped before the job even started. Silas Reeve simply nodded once, his expression unchanged, as if being under constant surveillance was as unremarkable as weather or traffic. He asked no questions. He made no small talk. When Garrett finished speaking and asked if everything was clear, Silas responded with 3 words: "Everything is clear." Then Garrett left him alone, and Silas began his first night in the Ashford estate as if he'd worked there for years. He moved with a deliberation that suggested not caution, but respect, the way someone might move through a museum, aware that beauty surrounded them, but that beauty was not theirs to disturb. His first task was the main foyer, a vaulted space with imported Italian marble floors that showed every scuff and required weekly polishing to maintain their mirror shine. Most janitors attacked this space with the speed of someone trying to finish an unpleasant chore. Silas approached it like a craftsman. His mop strokes followed a pattern left to right in overlapping arcs, 33 passes that covered the floor without redundancy or gap. Elena found herself watching not because she suspected anything, but because the precision was almost hypnotic. He finished the foyer in 28 minutes and moved to the kitchen, where industrial-grade appliances gleamed under recessed lighting. Here, too, his movements held that same measured quality, as if time was abundant and rushing would only create inferior results. He wiped down the stainless steel refrigerator with vertical strokes, then horizontal, then vertical again, until the surface held no streaks or fingerprints. He cleaned the inside of the microwave that was used perhaps once a month, scrubbing at a stain that was barely visible until it vanished completely. When he emptied the trash, he replaced the liner with crisp corners, folded precisely the way a Marine might fold a flag. Elena told herself she was simply evaluating a new employee. She told herself this was reasonable oversight given the turnover in this position. But when she glanced at the clock and realized she'd been watching for an hour and 17 minutes, had forgotten about the invoices entirely, had even missed Harper's goodnight text, she felt something twist in her chest. That might have been shame or might have been something else, something she didn't have a name for yet. At 2:30 a.m., Silas took his break in the staff room, a small space off the kitchen with a table, a coffee maker, and a refrigerator stocked weekly with drinks and snacks for household employees. He sat at the table and unwrapped a sandwich from a plastic bag, turkey and cheese on wheat bread. Nothing fancy, probably made at home before his shift. He ate slowly, methodically, his gaze somewhere in the middle distance. He didn't check a phone because he didn't seem to have one with him. He didn't read or listen to music or do any of the things people normally did to fill silence. He simply sat and ate and existed, and Elena found this more unsettling than if he'd been doing something suspicious. 30 minutes later, he resumed work, and it was then at 3:47 a.m. that the pattern began, which would dominate Elena's thoughts for the next 2 months. Silas finished cleaning the first-floor corridors and began his assigned route through the East Wing, where guest bedrooms sat empty most of the year, and the air held that peculiar stillness of spaces rarely inhabited. But instead of moving straight through to the service areas beyond, he stopped. The camera in the East Wing hallway captured him, standing before the portrait of Catherine Ashford. The painting was 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, oil on canvas, commissioned 3 months before Catherine's death by an artist who specialized in medical professionals. It showed Catherine at 60 wearing the navy scrubs she'd favored during her years as a nursing educator, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, her hands folded at her waist. But it was her eyes that the artist had captured perfectly, that particular quality of seeing that came from decades of watching people at their most vulnerable and choosing every single time to meet vulnerability with kindness rather than exploitation. Elena had placed the portrait here because this hallway received good natural light during the day and because it was far enough from the main areas that she could pass it without having to look if she wasn't ready. Some days she could look at her mother's painted face for hours. Other days, even a glimpse felt like touching an open wound. Silas stood before the portrait for 2 minutes and 14 seconds. Elena watched him from her study upstairs, her hand hovering over the mouse as if she might zoom in for a closer view, though the 8K resolution already showed every detail of his expression. He didn't reach toward the painting. He didn't seem to study it the way someone might study art. He simply stood there, present and still. And then so quietly that even the enhanced microphones barely caught it, he said something. The audio was insufficient. Elena rewound the footage 3 times, adjusted the filters, boosted the levels, but the words remained just below the threshold of intelligibility, consonants, without vowels, meaning without message. Then Silas bowed his head slightly, just a few degrees, the kind of gesture someone might make at a gravestone or a memorial, and walked away. He returned to his work as if nothing unusual had happened. He finished his shift at exactly 7:00 a.m., 12 minutes after sunrise, and left through the service entrance without speaking to anyone. Elena sat in her study with the footage frozen on her screen, Silas's face half-shadowed in the pre-dawn light of the East Wing corridor. She told herself this meant nothing. Employees sometimes paused to look at artwork. The house was full of valuable pieces, and curiosity was natural. But this hadn't looked like curiosity. This had looked like reverence, and reverence implied relationship, and relationship implied history. And Silas Reeves' employment file said nothing about any connection to Catherine Ashford or the foundation or any aspect of Elena's world. She pulled up his background check again and read every line. Born in Hartford, Connecticut, 1983, graduated from Central Connecticut State University with a degree in accounting. Worked at Deloitte from 2010 to 2019 as a forensic accountant, according to LinkedIn, though that detail wasn't in the Hampton file. Married 2008, wife deceased 2019. One daughter, no criminal record, no liens or bankruptcies, no social media presence beyond a defunct Facebook account that hadn't been updated since 2018. He was on paper exactly what he appeared to be, a man who'd had a professional career and then stepped away from it, probably because grief or exhaustion or the demands of single parenthood made continuing impossible. Elena knew about stepping away. She'd retired from private equity at 43 after her mother's death, not because she needed to financially, but because the work that had once felt important, the negotiations, the acquisitions, the careful dismantling and reconstruction of companies to maximize value, suddenly seemed trivial. Her mother had spent 40 years teaching nurses how to care for dying patients with dignity. Elena had spent 20 years teaching corporations how to extract profit from inefficiency. The moral calculus of these two lives placed side by side was devastating. The foundation had been her attempt at rebalancing that calculus. The Catherine Ashford Foundation for Compassionate Care, established with a $50 million endowment dedicated to training nurses in the kind of end-of-life care that treated death not as a failure of medicine, but as a passage requiring as much skill and attention as birth. Her mother would have loved it. Her mother would also have hated that it took her death to inspire it. Elena tried not to think about that second part too often. She watched Silas's second shift with the same attention she'd given to the first. He arrived at 10:58 p.m., performed the same tasks in nearly the same order, and at 3:47 a.m. he stood before Catherine's portrait again. This time, Elena had already adjusted all the cameras in that corridor to maximum resolution, had tested the audio at every frequency, had positioned herself at her desk with coffee and notepad as if she were conducting an investigation rather than indulging in obsession. The visit lasted 1 minute and 54 seconds. Silas stood in the same spot as before, hands at his sides, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, and Elena was certain now that he was speaking, though the words remained inaudible, his lips moved with the careful shape of someone praying or reciting something memorized. Then he left, and the rest of his shift proceeded with the same meticulous care as the night before. By the fourth night, Elena had begun cataloging everything. She created a spreadsheet with columns for arrival time, task duration, break length, departure time, and a notes section where she recorded anomalies. The portrait visits went in the anomaly column, though. After 4 consecutive nights, they were less anomaly than pattern. She noted that he always stopped at exactly 3:47 a.m., never earlier, never later. She noted that the visits varied in length from 90 seconds to 3 minutes 8 seconds. She noted that he never touched the frame, never adjusted his position, never did anything except stand and speak words she couldn't hear. On the 7th night, she was waiting in the kitchen when he arrived for his 2:30 a.m. break. She'd told herself she wouldn't do this, that confronting him directly would reveal the extent of her surveillance and make the working relationship untenable. But the not knowing had become a physical sensation, a pressure behind her sternum that grew with each day, and she'd learned over the past 18 months that ignoring pressure only made it worse. He looked up when she entered, and something flickered across his face too quickly for her to identify before settling into polite neutrality. Professional mask perfectly fitted. He stood, set down his sandwich, and waited. She'd rehearsed this conversation 3 times in her study, had prepared questions designed to extract information without revealing how much she'd been watching. But standing here now 3 feet from him, in the cold fluorescent light of the staff kitchen, all her careful preparation evaporated. What came out instead was raw and artless. "Why do you visit my mother's portrait every night?" The silence stretched long enough that Elena wondered if he would answer at all. His eyes held hers, not aggressive, not challenging, but direct in a way that suggested he wasn't afraid of this conversation, even if she was. "She reminds me of someone who helped my family a long time ago," a pause as if he was deciding how much truth to offer. "Then a nurse. When my wife was dying." The nurse had the same kindness in her eyes. Elena felt something in her chest shift like ice beginning to crack. "My mother was a nurse. Maybe they—" Silas shook his head gently. "Different person, but the same spirit. I guess I'm paying respects to that kind of goodness wherever I find it." "Your wife, how did she—" "Cancer. 5 years ago. Our daughter was 4. The arithmetic assembled itself unbidden in Elena's mind. A 4-year-old, then was 9, now the same age as the daughter listed in his employment file. The wife's death was 2019, which aligned with the end of his Deloitte employment. The story was internally consistent, which should have been reassuring, but somehow wasn't. People lied with consistency all the time. That was what made lies effective. "I'm sorry." The words felt inadequate even as she spoke them. "I lost my mother 18 months ago." Something in his posture softened, not dramatically, but enough that Elena noticed. Then you understand. Grief makes us do strange things. I visit a portrait of a stranger. You probably do things that don't make sense either. She wanted to deny this to insist that her surveillance was rational and justified and bore no resemblance to whatever impulse brought him to her mother's portrait at 3:47 every morning. But the denial caught in her throat because he'd seen through to something true. She was doing strange things. She'd been doing them for 18 months. And maybe the only difference between her grief and his was that she had the money to build an infrastructure around hers to professionalize it with cameras and security systems and the language of due diligence. I'm just being careful. His expression didn't change, but something in his voice suggested gentle disagreement. Nothing wrong with careful, but sometimes careful becomes afraid, and afraid becomes alone. The observation landed with uncomfortable accuracy. Elena felt her defensive walls rising, the familiar urge to end this conversation and retreat back upstairs, where she could watch him through cameras instead of standing here exposed to direct perception. Is there anything else you need, Mr. Reeve? No, ma'am. She turned and walked away, feeling his gaze on her back until she rounded the corner. In her study, she pulled up the kitchen camera and watched him return to his sandwich. His movements unchanged, as if the conversation had affected him no more than a passing cloud affects stone. She replayed their exchange in her mind, analyzing each statement for hidden meanings, and found herself stuck on his final observation. Careful becomes afraid, becomes alone. The progression had the ring of lived experience, and she wondered what kind of afraid he'd been, what kind of alone before he'd arrived at her door asking to clean floors for $19 an hour. Harper found her the next morning still sitting at the surveillance monitors, the coffee in her mug. Long cold. Elena, you didn't sleep. A statement, not a question. Harper had worked as her assistant for 4 years and had learned to recognize the signs. I was reviewing footage of the new janitor. Elena, this is the 4th person in 18 months. At some point, you have to accept that maybe they're not all hiding something. Elena didn't answer. Harper sighed and set down a fresh coffee, the kind of gesture that had kept their professional relationship intact, even as Elena's paranoia made employment increasingly difficult. Dr. Torres called. You missed yesterday's session. I was busy. You said you'd go twice a month. It's been 6 weeks. Elena finally looked up from the monitors. Harper stood with her arms crossed, wearing the expression of someone who'd reached the limit of patience and was now operating on principle. I'll reschedule. Today. I already made an appointment for 4 p.m. I'll drive you myself if I have to. The threat was real. Harper had done it before, had physically placed herself between Elena and her study door until Elena agreed to get in the car. Some people might have fired an assistant for such behavior. Elena paid Harper double the market rate specifically because she would do this. Fine. Today at 4. Harper nodded once and left. Elena returned to the monitors where Silas had just arrived for his shift. She watched him move through the foyer with the same methodical precision as every night before and wondered what Harper would say if she knew Elena had spent $87,000 in the past week upgrading the cameras in the East Wing to 8K resolution and installing parabolic microphones sensitive enough to pick up whispers from 40 feet away. The new equipment was installed by Tuesday. Elena spent Wednesday afternoon testing it, having Garrett stand in various positions in the East Wing corridor and speak at different volumes while she fine-tuned the audio filters upstairs. By Wednesday night, the system could capture a cough from 3 rooms away. It felt like overkill. It felt like exactly what she needed. At 3:47 a.m., Silas stopped before Catherine's portrait. Elena sat forward in her chair, every muscle tense, her hand already moving to adjust the audio levels before he even began to speak. The new microphones captured everything. Thank you. The words were barely audible, spoken so softly they might have been breath given shape. Thank you for teaching her. Teaching who Elena's voice was a whisper in the empty study, as if Silas might somehow hear her through the cameras. For showing her that care is listening, that listening is love. When Grace was dying, she made Grace feel seen. Grace, the wife, the cancer patient. And she was the nurse, the one with Catherine's eyes, the one Silas claimed was a different person but with the same spirit. The pieces were assembling themselves into something that made sense on the surface but felt incomplete underneath, like a puzzle missing its center. I wish I could have thanked you in person. I wish a lot of things. He stood there another 30 seconds in silence, then walked away. Elena played the audio 7 times, listening for undertones, for anything that might explain why a man who'd never met her mother would stand before her portrait every night and offer thanks for teaching someone else. The logic was there if she squinted, gratitude transferred through generations, the way a student might honor a teacher's teacher, but it still felt like she was missing something crucial. She pulled up the footage from night one and began working backward, watching Silas's movements in reverse, looking for the moment when he'd first seen the portrait and decided it meant something. But there was no such moment. He'd walked past it during his initial orientation with Garrett, and his eyes had moved over it with the same neutral attention he gave to every other piece of art in the house. The fixation had developed later, or had been planned from the beginning and hidden during that first pass. The idea that Silas might have taken this job specifically because of Catherine's portrait opened up possibilities Elena didn't want to examine. It suggested premeditation research, an agenda beyond simple employment. And if he had an agenda, then everything else, the meticulous work ethic, the quiet dignity, the careful respect for her home, might be performance rather than character. She told herself she was being paranoid. She told herself this was exactly the kind of thinking Dr. Torres had warned against, the hypervigilance that turned every human interaction into a potential threat. But she couldn't stop. The cameras had given her the ability to see everything, and now that she could see, stopping felt impossible. It would be like having vision and choosing blindness. On night 15, a pipe burst in the exterior wall near the guest house. The temperature had dropped to -11 Celsius, cold enough that water inside copper tubing expanded and cracked seams that had held for 30 years. Elena woke to alerts on her phone at 4:02 a.m. Motion detected in garage, motion detected in exterior zones, multiple systems reporting anomalies. She pulled up the feeds and saw water spraying in a silver arc across frozen ground, already beginning to ice over. Garrett was on the phone with the emergency maintenance service. 2-hour wait, he said when Elena called him. Roads are sheets of ice. They're prioritizing medical facilities first. Elena watched the water spray and calculated damage. 40,000 in foundation and repairs. Another 10 for the walkway. Maybe 15 if the drainage system froze and cracked. The numbers assembled themselves out of habit, the way they always did, though increasingly she found herself not caring about money the way she once had. What good was wealth when the person you'd wanted to share it with was gone? Then Silas appeared on the exterior camera, moving quickly across the frozen lawn toward the burst pipe. He wore no coat, just the gray uniform that offered zero insulation against cold that could cause frostbite in minutes. Elena switched to the garage camera and saw that he'd entered through the service door and was pulling tools from the maintenance cabinet, tools he shouldn't have access to because that cabinet required a code known only to senior staff. But the door was already open, and Silas was gathering what he needed: pipe wrench, sealant, emergency shutoff key. Elena toggled to the security office feed and saw the answer. Garrett had given him, the code was standing there watching as Silas worked with the kind of speed that came from real urgency rather than performance. She switched back to exterior cameras. Silas was at the pipe now, hands touching metal that had to be agonizingly cold, assessing the damage with efficiency that suggested training beyond janitorial work. He moved to the emergency shutoff valve located behind a panel that wasn't marked anywhere on the estate blueprints given to household staff, and opened it with 3 precise motions. The water stopped spraying. He returned to the burst pipe and began applying the sealant, his fingers moving, despite what must have been significant pain. Elena watched for 38 minutes. When Silas finished, his hands were visibly red, edging toward purple, and he stood for a moment looking at his work with an expression that might have been satisfaction or might have been something else. Then he spoke, not to anyone present, just to the air, or to himself, or to whatever presence he believed might be listening. Some things have to be done right, even when nobody's watching, especially when nobody's watching. Elena felt something shift in her chest, some internal architecture rearranging itself. She'd been watching. She was always watching. But Silas didn't know that, couldn't know that, and his words suggested a moral framework that existed independent of observation. He did right work because it was right, not because someone might see and reward it. The cameras captured his actions but missed their meaning, and for the first time since installing the surveillance system, Elena wondered if maybe watching wasn't the same as understanding. Harper found her at 8:30 a.m., still in the study, footage of the pipe repair frozen on the screen. "You never went to bed." Elena didn't look up. "He saved $40,000 in damage." "Who did the janitor?" "Silas Reeve." Harper crossed to the monitor and studied the image of Silas with his frost-damaged hands, his face showing the kind of exhaustion that came from pushing through pain because the alternative was failure. "That's good of him. It doesn't make sense. He's not paid to do repairs. He doesn't have training for that kind of work. Why would he care enough to risk frostbite?" "Maybe because he's a decent human being," Harper said quietly. Maybe that's all it is. Elena wanted to believe this. She wanted to believe that some people were simply good, that their actions didn't require investigation or explanation, that kindness could exist without agenda. But 18 months of hypervigilance had rewired her brain, and she couldn't stop seeing patterns where maybe there were only coincidences, couldn't stop looking for the angle that would explain why a man with a degree in accounting was working as a janitor and visiting her dead mother's portrait and repairing frozen pipes at 4 in the morning. I want you to do something for me. Harper's expression suggested she already knew she wouldn't like this. What researched Silas Reeve? Not just employment history, everything. Where he worked before Deloitte, where he went to college, his wife's death hospital records, if you can access them legally, obituary at minimum, the daughter's school records, everything that's public or quasi-public. Elena, I need to know who he is. I need to understand why he's here. Harper was quiet for a long moment. Then, what happens when you find out he's just a guy trying to make rent? What happens when all this investigation reveals exactly what he appears to be? Elena didn't have an answer. She turned back to the monitor where Silas stood frozen in the moment before he spoke about doing things right when nobody watched. Except somebody had been watching. She'd been watching. And maybe that was the problem. Maybe the cameras had taught her how to observe, but stolen her ability to trust what she observed. Harper left without another word. Elena stayed in the study until early afternoon, reviewing footage from all 15 nights, looking for anything she might have missed. The work was tedious and probably pointless, but it gave her something to do besides sit with the growing realization that her mother would have been ashamed of this. Catherine had built her career on seeing people clearly, on stripping away the defenses and fears that prevented genuine connection, on believing that every patient deserved to be known rather than simply treated. Elena had taken her mother's death and used it as justification for the exact opposite, for replacing knowing with monitoring, connection with surveillance, trust with data. At 4 p.m., Harper appeared in the doorway. Dr. Torres is expecting you. Elena looked up from the monitors, disoriented, as if returning from a great distance. I can't today. I have too much to... You promised. Harper's voice carried the kind of firmness that suggested the conversation was over. The car is ready. We're leaving in 5 minutes whether you're ready or not. They drove in silence through Greenwich, past estates that rivaled Elena's in size and probably exceeded it in warmth, through neighborhoods where actual families lived rather than isolated people rattling around in houses too big for loneliness. Dr. Torres's office was in a converted Victorian near the waterfront, all hardwood floors and exposed brick, the kind of place designed to feel safe rather than clinical. Dr. Raymond Torres was 60, Puerto Rican via Brooklyn, with gray hair and the kind of eyes that missed nothing but judged less. He'd been Elena's therapist for 2 years, had seen her through the worst of the grief after Catherine's death, and had been increasingly concerned about her withdrawal from everything except the foundation and the cameras. Elena, he gestured to the familiar leather chair. She sat. How have you been? The question was standard, but Elena found she didn't have a standard answer. Fine didn't fit. Terrible would be too dramatic. She settled on evasion. Busy with the foundation. The new scholarship program is launching next quarter. How many cameras now? She should have expected this. Dr. Torres didn't waste time on pleasantries when he sensed deflection. 47. And how many hours per day do you spend watching the footage? Elena didn't answer. Dr. Torres waited. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. 4, maybe 5, maybe 5. You're uncertain about something you have complete control over. That tells me you're not tracking the hours, because tracking would require admitting how significant they've become. I'm being careful. After what happened to my mother, your mother died because a cough button malfunctioned and a nurse got distracted. Terrible things, yes. Preventable, maybe. But not your fault, and not something cameras in your house will prevent from happening again. If you'd been watching, you would have seen your mother die in real time with no ability to intervene because you were in a meeting 40 minutes away. The cameras wouldn't have changed the outcome. They would have just given you high-definition footage of your powerlessness. The words hit like a physical blow. Elena felt her throat tighten, her eyes begin to burn. I can't lose anyone else. So you're making sure there's no one close enough to lose. Dr. Torres leaned forward. Elena, 47 cameras means you're not protecting the people in your life. It means you've arranged your life so there are no people in it except employees you can monitor and an assistant you're slowly driving away. Harper isn't. Harper is loyal beyond reason, which is why she's still there. But I spoke with her last week. She's concerned. She used the word frightened, actually. Not of you, but for you. the information that Harper had called Dr. Bao. Torres should have felt like betrayal. Instead, it felt like proof that Elena's isolation was even more complete than she'd realized. Even the person paid to stay was looking for exit strategies. Tell me about Silas Reeve. Elena's head snapped up. What Harper mentioned, you've been particularly focused on the new janitor. Tell me about him. There's nothing to tell. He's an employee. I'm evaluating his performance. At 3 in the morning, every night for the past 2 weeks, he does something odd. He visits my mother's portrait every night. I'm trying to understand why. Dr. Torres was quiet for a moment. Have you asked him? Yes. What did he say? That my mother reminds him of a nurse who cared for his wife when she was dying. That he's paying respects to that kind of goodness. And you don't believe him. I don't know what to believe. Elena, that's progress. Not knowing is uncomfortable, but it's also honest. The cameras have been giving you a false sense of certainty, the feeling that if you can see everything, you can understand everything. But human motivation doesn't work that way. Sometimes people do things for reasons that don't make logical sense but are emotionally true. What if he's dangerous? What if he isn't? What if he's exactly what he appears to be, a man who lost his wife, who's raising a daughter alone, who found a job that lets him honor a memory while paying his bills? Elena wanted to accept this. But acceptance required trust, and trust required vulnerability. And vulnerability was exactly what the cameras were supposed to eliminate. The session continued another 30 minutes, but Elena stopped listening. She was thinking about Silas standing before Catherine's portrait, whispering words of gratitude for teaching someone else how to care. She was thinking about his hands purple with frostbite fixing a pipe that wasn't his responsibility, because some things have to be done right even when nobody's watching. She was thinking about how the cameras showed her everything except the one thing that mattered, whether the man she was watching deserved the suspicion she couldn't stop giving him. Harper delivered the research file 3 days later, a manila folder thick enough to suggest thoroughness or obsession, or both. She set it on Elena's desk without comment, her expression carefully neutral, in the way that meant she had opinions but wouldn't share them unless asked. Elena didn't ask. She waited until Harper left before opening the folder, as if reading it alone might somehow make the invasion of privacy less egregious. The first page was a timeline. Silas Reeve, born Hartford, Connecticut, 1983, only child of parents who died in a car accident when he was 17. Raised after that by an aunt who passed in 2007. Graduated Central Connecticut State, 2005 with a 3.7 GPA in accounting. Married Grace Holloway, 2008 in a small ceremony at a Methodist church in West Hartford. One daughter born 2015 named Zola. Grace diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer, January 2018 died, April 2019, at St. Michael's Hospital Palliative Care Unit after 3 months of treatment that bought time but not cure. Silas resigned from Deloitte May 2019, 1 month after her death. Employment history after that was spotty tax preparation during filing season, bookkeeping for small businesses, a 6-month stint, driving for a rideshare service that ended when the car needed repairs he couldn't afford. Current residence, a 2-bedroom apartment in Bridgeport, monthly rent, $195 checking account balance as of last month, $314. The numbers told a story of gradual economic erosion, a middle-class life slowly collapsing under the weight of medical debt and single parenthood. The obituary for Grace Reeve was brief, just the standard facts, but someone had included a handwritten note at the bottom. In lieu of flowers, donations to St. Michael's Hospital Palliative Care Unit in honor of the nurses who made her final days peaceful. Elena read that line 3 times, feeling something shift in her understanding. This wasn't a man with hidden agendas. This was a man who'd been broken by the kind of loss that couldn't be fixed with money or time or surveillance cameras. The next section was about Zola. School records showed a bright child, strong in mathematics and science, but notes from teachers mentioned social struggles. One report from 3rd grade said Zola had difficulty making friends, that she seemed to carry burdens unusual for her age. Another mentioned an incident where Zola had gotten into an argument with a classmate who'd made a comment about her father's employment. The child had called Silas a janitor in the mocking tone that children learn from parents who should know better, and Zola had pushed her. 3-day suspension, both students disciplined equally under a zero-tolerance policy that punished the victim and the bully with the same indifference. Elena closed the folder and sat staring at nothing. Every piece of information confirmed what Silas had told her: wife dead from cancer, daughter being raised alone, a man doing whatever work he could find to keep food on the table and a roof overhead. There was no conspiracy, no hidden connection to Catherine beyond the second-hand link through a nurse whose kindness had meant everything in a moment when everything was ending. And yet Elena had spent 2 weeks treating him like a suspect, had spent $87,000 on upgraded surveillance, had enlisted Harper to investigate his life like he was a threat rather than a person struggling through grief, just as she was. The shame of this settled into her bones and stayed there. That night, when Silas appeared on the monitors at 10:58 p.m., Elena forced herself to watch only the first 30 minutes, then shut down the system and went to bed. The act of not watching felt like holding her breath underwater, possible for a while, and increasingly desperate, ultimately unsustainable. She lasted until 2:15 a.m. before returning to the study and pulling up the live feeds. Silas was in the East Wing now, moving through empty bedrooms with the same careful attention he gave to everything, and Elena hated herself for the relief she felt at seeing him there, at knowing where he was and what he was doing. At 3:47 a.m., he stopped before Catherine's portrait. Elena had promised herself she wouldn't watch this part anymore, that she would give him this small privacy, but her hand moved to the monitor controls before conscious thought could intervene, zooming in on his face as he began to speak. "I wish I could have thanked you in person. Your daughter seems lost the way Grace was lost before Rena helped her see that being scared was okay. Maybe she needs what you taught that nurse, how to see people's hearts instead of their armor." Elena felt something crack open in her chest. He was praying for her. This man she'd been surveilling and investigating and suspecting was standing in her house at 4 in the morning, asking her dead mother to help her, to teach her the lessons that Elena had apparently failed to learn, despite having Catherine as an example for 41 years. The cameras had shown her this moment, but they hadn't prepared her for what it would mean, that kindness could exist without transaction, that people could care about strangers for no reason except that caring was its own justification. She turned off the monitors and went downstairs. Her footsteps echoed through the vast house, each room perfect and empty. Millions of dollars of marble and mahogany and art that meant nothing because there was no one to share it with. Harper was right. Dr. Torres was right. She'd built a fortress of surveillance to protect herself from connection, and the protection had become a prison. The East Wing hallway was dark except for the soft glow of emergency lighting. Silas heard her approach and turned, his face showing no surprise, as if he'd been expecting this confrontation or had moved beyond the point where anything could surprise him. They stood 3 feet apart in the half-light, two people united by losses they couldn't fix and grief they couldn't escape. "I know why you come here." His posture shifted slightly, preparing for whatever came next. "Ma'am Rena Holbrook, she cared for your wife. She was trained by my mother at St. Michael's Hospital, part of a program my mother ran for palliative care nurses." I looked it up. Silas was quiet for a long moment, weighing something internal. "How did you find out?" The honest answer was that Harper had tracked down hospital records and cross-referenced nursing staff with the Catherine Ashford Foundation scholarship recipients until the connection revealed itself. But Elena found she didn't want to admit the extent of the investigation. "I needed to understand why you were here. Are you going to fire me for what? For honoring my mother? For being grateful to someone who learned from her? For lying?" The words were soft but not defensive. "I told you the nurse reminded me of your mother." That wasn't exactly true. I never met Catherine. But Rena told Grace stories about her training, about this woman who taught that caring is listening and listening is love. When Grace was dying, Rena listened. She made Grace feel seen in a moment when everything was ending. And that was worth more than any treatment. Elena felt tears building behind her eyes, hot and insistent. "My mother would have been honored to know that her teaching mattered that way." "Would she be honored that you're watching me through 47 cameras?" The question landed without malice, but its accuracy was devastating. "You knew. I counted 24 visible cameras my first night, found 6 more hidden. When you started upgrading the system in week 2, I knew they were for me specifically. Why didn't you quit?" "Because I understood." His voice carried a gentleness that Elena didn't deserve. "You lost your mother the way I lost Grace. We both became afraid. You watch everything. I couldn't watch anything for 2 years, couldn't even look at photos. Grief makes us strangers to ourselves." Elena's throat was too tight for words. She stood there in the darkness, crying silently, and Silas waited with the patience of someone who knew that some pain couldn't be rushed. When she could finally speak, her voice came out raw. "Have you seen enough to trust me?" He looked confused. "Trust you? I've watched you for 63 nights. I know you're kind, careful, honest. I know you're a better person than I am. But have you seen enough to trust me because I've done nothing to earn it, Ms. Ashford? I've known since that night in the kitchen that you're suffering. I see it in how you move through your own house like a ghost afraid to be seen. I trust that you're in pain. The question is whether you trust that you can heal. I don't know how. Start small, turn off one camera, then another, until you remember what it's like to not be afraid. The prescription was simple and impossible. But standing here in the half-dark and with a man who had every reason to resent her surveillance but somehow didn't, Elena felt something shift. Not resolution, not sudden clarity, just the smallest opening where there had been only walls. She went upstairs and sat in the study staring at the bank of monitors showing empty rooms and hallways. 47 windows into a house where nothing happened except the quiet movement of one person trying to do his work with dignity. She reached for the power controls and hesitated, her hands shaking with something that might have been withdrawal or might have been the first tremor of freedom. Then she shut down the camera in the East Wing hallway. Just that one. The monitor went black and the world didn't end. The next night, she shut down 2 more. The night after that, 5. By the end of the week, she'd removed all the cameras from private staff areas, the break room, the locker spaces, the small bathroom near the service entrance where Garrett sometimes napped during slow hours. The act of not watching these spaces created an anxiety that was almost physical, but underneath the anxiety was something else, something that felt dangerously like relief. Harper noticed the change on Thursday morning. You're dismantling the system. Elena looked up from her desk where she'd been reviewing foundation grant applications instead of surveillance footage. Starting to. Why? Because Silas was right. I've been watching everything and seeing nothing. Harper sat down across from her, an unusual gesture that suggested this conversation was going to be more personal than their typical exchanges. Elena, I've worked for you for 4 years. In that time, I've seen you build something extraordinary with the foundation. I've also watched you disappear into this house like it's a tomb. That janitor did something I couldn't do. He made you realize you're still alive. The observation was accurate enough to sting. Elena wondered what it said about her life, that a man she'd hired to clean floors had broken through defenses that years of therapy and Harper's quiet concern couldn't penetrate. Maybe it was because Silas had no investment in her healing, no professional obligation or personal stake. He was just a person who'd survived his own drowning and recognized the signs in someone else. I want to do something. Harper waited, eyebrows raised. The Employee Family Support Program. The one the board approved last year, but we never funded properly. I want to fully implement it. Education expenses for employees' children, emergency financial assistance, mental health resources. Everything my mother would have insisted on if she were running the foundation. That'll cost about $150,000 annually. I'll fund it personally if the board objects. And I want the first beneficiary to be Zola Reeve. There was a science fair at her school she couldn't participate because of the entry fee. I want that covered, and I want to establish a scholarship fund for her education. Harper's expression softened into something that might have been pride or might have been relief that Elena was finally investing in something beyond surveillance equipment. I'll draft the program details by Monday. After Harper left, Elena pulled up the remaining camera feeds. 32 cameras still active, down from 47. The house looked different on the monitors, now less like a fortress being defended and more like a space gradually opening up. She watched Silas arrive for his shift, watched him move through the foyer with his methodical precision, and for the first time in 2 months, she found herself not looking for hidden meanings or suspicious behavior. Just watching a man do his work well because doing things well mattered to him. Saturday afternoon, she invited Silas to bring Zola to the estate. The request came through Harper, formal and careful, and Elena spent the 3 days before their visit second-guessing the impulse. What did she think would happen? That meeting a 9-year-old would somehow complete her transformation from paranoid recluse to functional human, that Zola would see through to some hidden goodness that Elena wasn't sure existed. But when they arrived on Saturday at 2 p.m., Zola stepping out of Silas's aging Honda with wide eyes and nervous energy, Elena felt something unexpected. Not hope exactly, but curiosity. The child had her father's careful watchfulness, but also something lighter, a resilience that hadn't been crushed yet by whatever the world was doing to her. Your house is really big. Elena knelt down to eye level, a gesture Catherine had taught her decades ago. You can't connect with a child while towering over them. It is. Would you like to see the gardens? They walked through the estate grounds, 20 acres of landscape beauty that Elena barely noticed anymore. But Zola saw everything the way morning glories climbed the arbor. The koi swimming in lazy circles through the pond, the monarch butterflies that had returned this spring for the first time in years. She asked questions the way children do without self-consciousness or fear of appearing ignorant. Why are some flowers purple and some yellow? Do the fish know their names? How do butterflies know where to go? Elena answered what she could, made up plausible responses when she couldn't, and found herself genuinely enjoying the conversation in a way she hadn't enjoyed human interaction in months. Silas walked a few feet behind them, close enough to intervene if needed, but far enough to let them develop their own rhythm. His expression held something Elena couldn't quite read. Gratitude maybe, or cautious hope, or the complex mixture of feelings that came from letting your child near someone with the power to help or hurt them. They paused near the rose garden, where late spring blooms were just beginning to open. Zola reached toward a pale pink flower and then stopped herself, looking back at Elena for permission. Elena nodded, and the child touched the petals with careful fingers, her face showing the kind of wonder that only came before life taught you to be suspicious of beauty. Ms. Ashford, do you have cameras in the garden? The question came without preamble, the way uncomfortable truths from children often did. Elena glanced at Silas, who was watching with interest to see how she'd answer. Not anymore. Why not? Because some things are too beautiful to watch through a screen. They have to be lived. Zola considered this with the seriousness that children brought to new concepts. Like what? Like this. Right now. You, me, your father, the butterflies, the sun. If I were watching this on a camera, I'd miss the smell of the roses, the sound of your voice, the feeling of being here instead of somewhere else watching here happen. That's smart, Zola said, as if conferring approval. Then Daddy says you knew a nurse who helped my mom. Is that true? Elena felt her throat tighten. Not exactly. The nurse who helped your mom was trained by my mother, so in a way my mother helped your mom even though they never met. That's like echoes. We learned about echoes in science class. Sound bounces and comes back. Her father uses that phrase. Love leaves echoes. Zola's face brightened. He tells me that all the time. It means Mommy's love is still here, even though she's not. Exactly. They spent another hour on the grounds before Silas said they should go. Zola had homework, and he had to prepare for his shift. But before they left, Elena made an offer she hadn't planned, words that came out before she could analyze whether they were wise. Zola, your father mentioned you wanted to enter the science fair at school. I'd like to sponsor your entry fee and anything else you need for your project. The child's eyes went wide. Really, really, and if you win, there's a scholarship fund that will help pay for college someday. That's part of a program I'm starting to help families like yours. Silas's expression shifted into something complicated. Pride mixed with discomfort, gratitude fighting with the fear of accepting charity. Ms. Ashford, you don't have to. I want to. Elena met his eyes. My mother spent 40 years teaching nurses how to care for people. This is me trying to learn the same lesson. Better late than never. The conversation ended there, but as Elena watched them drive away, Zola waving through the rear window until the car disappeared down the long driveway, she felt something she hadn't felt in 18 months. Not happiness exactly, but a sense that maybe the isolation could end, that maybe the walls she'd built could come down without everything collapsing. That night, when Silas arrived for his shift, Elena wasn't in the surveillance room. She was in the library reading or trying to read, mostly just holding a book and thinking about a 9-year-old's wonder at butterflies and roses. At 3:47 a.m., she heard footsteps in the East Wing hallway and knew without checking the cameras that Silas was visiting Catherine's portrait. She stayed in the library, giving him the privacy she should have given him from the start, trusting that whatever he said to her mother's painted face was between them and none of her business. The dismantling continued over the next 2 weeks. More cameras removed, more audio disabled, more spaces given back their privacy. Elena found that the less she watched, the more she noticed the way morning light moved across the foyer's marble, the particular silence that settled over the house at dusk, the gradual loosening of the knot in her chest that had been there so long she'd stopped recognizing it as abnormal. Doctor Torres noticed the change in their next session. You look different. Elena had been staring out the window at Long Island Sound, watching sailboats trace white lines across blue water. Different how? Present, like you're actually here instead of monitoring yourself from somewhere else. I'm trying to be. It's harder than it should be. Recovery always is. The thing we're recovering from becomes comfortable even when it's killing us. Letting go feels like falling. The metaphor was accurate. Elena did feel like she was falling, or maybe learning to fly. It was hard to tell the difference when you'd spent so long grounded by fear. She told Dr. Torres about Silas, about the cameras, about Zola and the garden, and the slow dismantling of her surveillance fortress. She expected judgment, or at least the therapeutic version of, I told you so, but Dr. Torres just listened with the attention that made him good at his work. What do you think your mother would say about all this? The question hit harder than expected. Elena closed her eyes and tried to imagine Catherine in this room, tried to hear her voice offering perspective. I think she'd say I was finally starting to understand what she spent her whole life teaching. That seeing people requires presence, not observation. That you can't care for someone while hiding behind a lens. What else? That it's not too late. That grief doesn't have to be permanent isolation. That love leaves echoes, and I should listen for them instead of trying to watch them. Dr. Torres smiled. Your mother taught well. The foundation board meeting happened on a Tuesday morning. All 12 members gathered in the conference room that overlooked the harbor. Elena had prepared her presentation carefully, knowing that some board members would resist the expanded employee family support program on principle, believing that philanthropy should extend outward to communities rather than inward to staff. Thomas Brennan, the most conservative voice on the board and someone who'd worked with Catherine for 20 years, would be the hardest sell. She presented the numbers. First, $150,000 annually split between education expenses, emergency financial assistance, and mental health resources for all foundation employees and their families. Then she presented the philosophy an organization dedicated to compassionate care couldn't credibly preach that mission if it didn't practice it internally. The nurses they trained went into the world treating patients with dignity. The foundation should offer its own people the same standard. Thomas listened without interrupting his expression, giving nothing away. When Elena finished, he was the first to speak. It's a generous program, but I'm concerned about scope creep. We're here to train healthcare workers, not run an HR benefits department. The objection was predictable. Elena had prepared for it. We can't train people in compassion if we treat our own employees as replaceable parts. This program isn't scope creep. It's mission alignment. Another board member, a physician named Rebecca Osei, raised her hand. I support this conceptually, but who would be first to benefit? Do we have specific families in mind? Yes. Elena pulled up the next slide showing Zola's science fair application and the breakdown of costs for a child whose parent made $19 an hour and barely kept food on the table. This is Zola Reeve. Her father works night shift maintenance at my estate. She's 9 years old, brilliant in mathematics, and couldn't participate in her school's science fair because of a $35 entry fee. That's what we're talking about, children with potential being excluded from opportunities because of trivial amounts that we spend on coffee service at board meetings. The room went quiet. Elena let the silence sit until it became uncomfortable, then pushed further. My mother built this foundation on the principle that every person deserves dignity, especially at the most vulnerable moments. But dignity isn't something we reserve for patients in hospital beds. It's something we extend to everyone we encounter, including the people who clean our offices and maintain our buildings and work overnight so they can be home when their children wake up. Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying her. This is personal for you. Everything is personal, Elena said. That's what I'm finally learning. The moment we treat people as abstractions instead of individuals with names and faces and children who need science fair entry fees, we've failed the mission my mother dedicated 40 years to building. The vote was 9-3 in favor. Thomas voted no, along with 2 others who thought the foundation should maintain traditional boundaries between employer and employee. But the majority carried, and by the meeting's end, Elena had approval to launch the program immediately. The first check made out to Zola Reeve for educational expenses would be processed by Friday. She called Silas that afternoon from the office, rather than waiting for his evening shift. Harper had given her his cell number with a raised eyebrow that suggested Elena was crossing some professional boundary, but professional boundaries suddenly seemed less important than making sure he knew about the scholarship before someone else told him. Mr. Reeve, this is Elena Ashford. A pause on the other end, long enough that Elena wondered if he was deciding whether to answer professionally or hang up on the billionaire who'd spent 2 months treating him like a suspect. Ms. Ashford, is something wrong? Nothing's wrong. I wanted to tell you that the board approved the Employee Family Support Program this morning. Zola's science fair entry is covered, plus there's a $2,000 scholarship fund for her future education expenses. The silence stretched longer this time. When Silas spoke again, his voice carried emotions he was trying to control. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. This is what the program is for, making sure that people who work for the foundation don't have to choose between bills and their children's futures. Ms. Ashford, this is... His voice cracked slightly. Zola's going to be so happy. She's been talking about that science fair project for months. What's the project about? Stellar echoes. How light from dead stars takes years to reach us, so we see them in the past, even though they're gone. She says it's like her mom. We can't see Grace anymore, but her light is still traveling, still reaching us. Elena felt her own throat tighten. That's beautiful. She got the idea from something I tell her, about love leaving echoes. Your daughter is lucky to have you. Another pause. Then, Ms. Ashford, can I ask you something? Of course. Why are you doing this? Not just the scholarship, all of it, bringing us to your house, starting this program, actually caring about people you don't have to care about. The question deserved honesty, because I watched you for 63 nights trying to find evidence that you were hiding something. And the only thing you were hiding was how much you were struggling. I wanted to catch you being suspicious, but instead I caught you being good. And that taught me something my mother tried to teach me for 40 years, that you can't see people clearly through cameras or paranoia or fear. You have to be present with them. You have to risk knowing them. Silas was quiet for so long, Elena thought he might have hung up. Then your mother would be proud of you. The words landed with weight. Elena thanked him and ended the call before emotion made conversation impossible. She sat in her office looking out at the harbor, watching boats navigate channels between rocks that could sink them if they miscalculated, and thought about risk and trust and the particular courage it took to dismantle defenses you'd built to survive. That evening, she removed 10 more cameras, leaving only 17 operational, the bare minimum needed for actual security rather than psychological crutch. The house felt exposed without the constant surveillance, like removing armor and discovering how much the protection had weighed. But exposure also meant possibility. For the first time since Catherine's death, Elena found herself thinking about hosting the Foundation's annual gala at the estate rather than renting a hotel ballroom, letting people in, taking the risk that presence required. She found Silas in the kitchen during his break, unwrapping the same turkey sandwich from the same plastic bag. They looked at each other across the professional distance that employment created, and Elena realized that despite everything, the surveillance, the investigation, the gradual dismantling of walls, they were still fundamentally strangers who happened to share grief and a house and a connection through a nurse who'd learned compassion from someone who'd died teaching it. I removed the camera in the East Wing hallway. Silas nodded slowly. Thank you. You can visit my mother's portrait without worrying that I'm watching. I know, but you'll still go, won't you? Every night at 3:47. His expression held quiet certainty. Not because I think you're watching, because some things matter whether anyone sees them or not. Elena understood this now in a way she hadn't 2 months ago. The cameras had taught her nothing except how to be alone with perfect information. Silas had taught her everything, that kindness didn't require audience, that dignity was something you carried rather than performed, that love really did leave echoes if you stopped watching long enough to listen for them. She went upstairs and shut down 5 more cameras, then sat in the darkness of her study with the monitors off and the house settling into its nighttime sounds around her. Somewhere below, Silas was moving through rooms she couldn't see doing work. She couldn't monitor, being exactly who he'd always been, whether she watched or not. And for the first time in 18 months, Elena Ashford fell asleep without checking the footage, first trusting that some things were safe to not know, that presence mattered more than surveillance. That healing began the moment you stopped hiding behind technology and started risking the vulnerability of actual human connection. The cameras would never come down completely. Some part of her would always want that control, that illusion of safety through observation. But 47 had become 17, and 17 felt like progress. Felt like something Catherine would recognize as her daughter finally learning the lessons that mattered, that watching was not the same as seeing, that security was not the same as connection, that the only way to truly honor the dead was to stop being afraid of the living. The Foundation's annual gala had always been held at the Delamar Hotel in Greenwich, a safe choice that required no personal exposure. But 3 months after the Employee Family Support Program launched, Elena made a decision that Harper greeted with barely concealed alarm. This year, the event would be at the estate. 200 donors, board members, and healthcare professionals gathering in a space Elena had spent 18 months treating as a fortress against human contact. The irony wasn't lost on her. The planning consumed June and July. Caterers toured the grounds, event coordinators mapped tent placements for outdoor reception areas, florists debated centerpiece options that would complement rather than overwhelm Catherine's aesthetic. Elena participated in these decisions with an attention to detail that surprised everyone, including herself. For years, she delegated such matters to Harper, treating them as administrative tasks beneath her concern. Now she found herself caring about whether the string quartet should set up near the Rose Garden or the koi pond, whether guests should enter through the main foyer or the West Terrace, whether the lighting would make people feel welcomed or merely observed. Silas continued his night shifts through all of this, arriving at 10:58 p.m. as he had for 4 months now, moving through rooms that were being gradually transformed for an event he would never attend. Elena had stopped watching him weeks ago, had dismantled enough cameras that whole sections of the house existed outside her surveillance. But she still knew his patterns through the indirect evidence he left behind: floors polished to mirror-shine windows without streaks, the small repairs he made without being asked. The house had never been cleaner, which Harper noted with dry amusement, suggested that actually trusting your employees produced better results than monitoring them constantly. Zola won her school's science fair in mid-July. The project on stellar echoes earned first place in the elementary division and qualified her for the regional competition in Hartford. Silas called Elena from the school gymnasium, his voice carrying an excitement he didn't try to hide. She's over the moon. They're giving her a trophy taller than she is. That's wonderful. When's the regional competition? September 15th. But the entry fee is $120 and we'd need to pay for materials to expand the display board. The scholarship fund covers that. Elena pulled up the program guidelines on her computer. Educational competitions are specifically included. Have the school send the invoice to Harper and we'll process it immediately. Ms. Ashford, I don't know how to thank you. Help me with something. The gala is August 20th. I'd like Zola to attend as a guest to see what the foundation does and meet some of the nurses we've trained. Would that be okay? The pause suggested that Silas was weighing factors Elena couldn't see. That's very generous, but she doesn't have anything appropriate to wear for an event like that. We'll handle that. Harper will reach out about details. After the call ended, Elena sat staring at the donor list for the gala, 200 names representing millions in contributions over the past decade. Most would expect the usual program speeches about Catherine's legacy presentations on how many nurses the foundation had trained, the careful performance of philanthropy that made wealthy people feel good about their wealth. But Elena found herself wanting something different this year, something her mother would have recognized as authentic rather than theatrical. She wanted people to meet Zola, to see the direct impact of caring about employees and their families, to understand that compassion wasn't abstract but specific. A 9-year-old building a science fair project about dead stars still shining, a father working nights to give her stability, a foundation learning to practice what it preached. The board met in early August to finalize gala details. Thomas Brennan, who'd served with Catherine for 20 years and represented the foundation's most conservative voices, raised immediate objections. This is a fundraising event, not a human interest story. Donors expect sophistication, not emotional manipulation through a sympathetic child. Rebecca O.C. bristled, showcasing the employee support program's impact isn't manipulation. It's demonstrating mission effectiveness. It's off message. We train nurses, not fund science fairs. Elena had stayed quiet through the debate, but this pushed her past diplomacy. Thomas, we train nurses because my mother believed healthcare required humanity. We fund Zola's education for the same reason. If you can't see the connection, you didn't understand Catherine as well as you think you did. The room went silent. Thomas's face showed the particular offense of someone used to deference being challenged publicly. I worked with your mother for 20 years, Elena. Don't presume to lecture me on her values. Then honor those values by supporting a program she would have championed. Elena kept her voice level but unyielding. Zola Reeve represents everything this foundation is supposed to stand for: potential being nurtured, families being supported, dignity being extended beyond hospital walls. If donors can't appreciate that, they're donating for the wrong reasons. Thomas stood abruptly. I'll abstain from this vote. The rest of you can decide whether we're running a serious charitable organization or an exercise in Elena's personal redemption. He left before anyone could respond. The remaining board members exchanged uncomfortable glances, the kind that happened when private tensions became public spectacle. But Rebecca spoke into the silence with quiet force. I move that we feature the employee support program prominently at the gala, including having Zola Reeve present as a program beneficiary. All in favor? 8 hands rose. 2 abstentions. The motion carried, and Elena felt something release in her chest that might have been vindication or might have been relief that other people saw what she was trying to build here. Harper waited until the board members filed out before approaching. That was brutal. It was necessary. Thomas has been with the foundation since before you were born. You just publicly humiliated him. He humiliated himself by suggesting that helping a 9-year-old contradicts the mission. Elena gathered her papers, hands steadier than she expected. My mother would have eviscerated him for that position. I was restrained by comparison. Your mother had 20 years of built credibility. You have 18 months of erratic behavior and good intentions. The assessment stung because it was accurate. Elena knew how she appeared to people like Thomas, the grieving daughter, playing at philanthropy, dismantling her mother's careful work, through impulsive decisions driven by trauma rather than strategy. But she also knew what the cameras had taught her in their final months, that observation without connection was just voyeurism, that safety without risk was just isolation, that honoring Catherine meant embodying her values rather than preserving her legacy in amber. I'm not trying to be my mother. I'm trying to learn from her. Those are different things. Harper's expression softened slightly. I know. Just remember that change makes people uncomfortable, even good change, especially good change that challenges how they see themselves. Elena tracked down Rena Holbrook through the Portland hospital where she now directed the palliative care program. The invitation was simple. Would you come back to Connecticut to talk about what Catherine had taught you, about how that teaching had shaped your career, and the hundreds of patients you'd cared for since Rena accepted? Immediately, her voice on the phone carrying emotions that suggested Catherine's impact had been profound and lasting. They met for coffee in downtown Greenwich a week before the event. Rena was 48 now, her dark hair threaded with silver, her face showing the particular wariness that came from years of shepherding people through death with as much grace as circumstances allowed. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that Elena recognized from her mother, the assurance of someone who'd found meaning in work most people couldn't tolerate. Thank you for inviting me. Rena stirred sugar into her coffee with careful attention. I've wanted to return to Connecticut for years to see what you've built with the foundation. Catherine would be so proud. Did she know? Before she died, did she know how much her teaching mattered? Rena's eyes grew distant. The last time we spoke was 3 weeks before her surgery. She called to check on a student I was mentoring, someone struggling with the emotional weight of hospice work. We talked for an hour about how to hold space for suffering without drowning in it. She said the hardest thing she'd ever learned was that you can't save everyone, but you can witness everyone. Make them feel seen in their final moments. That changes things even when outcomes don't. Elena felt tears building, but kept her voice steady. That was very her. The precision about emotional truth. She asked about you, asked if you were taking care of yourself. I said I didn't know, that we weren't close enough for me to ask personal questions. She said that was probably her fault, that she'd invested so much in teaching nurses that her own daughter had gotten leftover energy rather than full attention. That's not. Elena stopped recognizing the automatic defense for what it was. She was busy. I understood that. Understanding isn't the same as not being hurt by it. Rena's voice held gentle challenge. Catherine knew that too. She told me she wished she'd learned to balance better, that she hoped you'd find work that mattered, but wouldn't cost what hers cost. The conversation was venturing into territory Elena wasn't prepared for, truths she'd avoided examining too closely. But something about Rena's directness, the same quality that had probably made her exceptional at helping people die, with dignity prevented deflection. I'm trying. This gala, the employee support program, bringing people like you back to speak. It's me attempting to honor her work without repeating her mistakes. What mistakes? Caring about missions more than people. About abstract good rather than the specific humans in front of you. Catherine cared about people intensely. That was her genius and her limitation. What do you mean? She could walk into a hospital room and within 5 minutes know exactly what the patient needed. Physical comfort, emotional validation, spiritual reassurance. But she couldn't always extend that same attention to her family. It's like she had a fixed capacity for empathy, and once the work consumed it, nothing remained for home. Elena had never articulated this pattern, but hearing Rena describe it created sudden clarity. That's exactly what it was like. She'd come home exhausted from teaching or hospital rounds, and I'd want to tell her about school or friends or whatever mattered to 12-year-old me, and she'd listen, but I could feel the blankness behind her eyes. Like she'd given all the real attention away, and I got the performance of it. I'm sorry. Rena reached across the table, a gesture of connection that felt natural, despite them being essentially strangers. That must have been lonely. It was. But I also watched her change healthcare for thousands of patients. That had to count for something. It counted for everything and nothing. That's the impossible math of caretaking. You can't quantify meaning, but you still have to choose where to invest your limited capacity. The conversation shifted to logistics after that, details about the gala program and what Rena should emphasize in her remarks. But the earlier exchange stayed with Elena through the following days, adding weight to decisions about how to structure the event. She found herself wanting to feature not just the foundation's achievements, but its ongoing struggles. The difficulty of systemic change, the tension between growth and sustainability, the honest acknowledgement that caring for others while neglecting yourself or your family wasn't noble but corrosive. Silas brought out Zola to the estate 3 days before the gala for a final walkthrough. Harper had arranged for a dress, a deep blue that matched Zola's eyes and made her look older than 9, on the edge of the adolescence that would reshape her over the next few years. The child moved through the preparations with wide-eyed wonder, asking questions about the flower arrangements and the sound system and why anyone needed 3 different kinds of forks at a single meal. Elena found herself charmed by Zola's unfiltered curiosity, the way she pointed at expensive art, and asked, "What's that supposed to be?" without the embarrassment that socialization would eventually teach her. Silas followed a step behind, protective, but not smothering, letting his daughter explore while remaining close enough to intervene if needed. "Are you nervous about speaking at the gala?" Zola looked up from examining a sculpture of a heron in flight. "I'm supposed to speak, just briefly, about your science project and what the scholarship meant to your family." The child's face showed sudden anxiety. "In front of 200 people, more like 150 by the time you speak. Most will have moved to the bar area." Elena kept her tone light, trying to diffuse the fear. "And they'll be friendly. These are people who support education and young minds. They want to hear from you. What if I mess up? Then you'll be just like every other person who's ever given a speech. Perfection is boring. Authenticity is memorable." Silas stepped forward, his hand resting on Zola's shoulder. "Baby Ms. Ashford's right. Just tell them about the Stellar Echoes project. Talk about Mommy's light still reaching us. That's all you need to say. Can you be there, right where I can see you, front row center?" Silas's voice carried absolute certainty. "I wouldn't be anywhere else." The gala arrived with the kind of perfect August weather that seemed almost stage temperature, in the low 70s, humidity mercifully absent, just enough breeze to keep the outdoor areas comfortable without disrupting centerpieces. Elena spent the afternoon in preparations that felt more like meditation than work, arranging final details, walking through the grounds Catherine had designed 20 years earlier, letting herself feel the full weight of hosting 200 people in a space she'd spent 18 months hiding in. Harper found her near the koi pond at 5 p.m., 2 hours before guests would arrive. "You should get ready." "I am ready. You're wearing jeans and a t-shirt." Elena looked down as if noticing her clothes for the first time. "Right, okay." She showered and dressed in a black gown that Harper had selected, something elegant but not ostentatious, appropriate for someone hosting a charity event rather than attending a society wedding. The woman in the mirror looked different than 18 months ago. Still thin but no longer gaunt. Still serious but less haunted. Still carrying grief but wearing it differently now. Like a scar instead of an open wound. Guests began arriving at 7. Elena stood near the entrance with a glass of champagne she wouldn't drink and greeted people with the practiced ease that private equity had taught her. Donors, board members, nurses who'd gone through Catherine's training programs, all moving through the estate with expressions ranging from impressed to overwhelmed. The house did that to people, announced wealth so loudly that conversation became difficult until you adjusted to the volume. Silas and Zola arrived at 7:30. Elena had arranged for them to use the main entrance rather than the service door, a small gesture that felt larger than it should have. The child wore her blue dress with visible pride, her natural hair pulled back in braids decorated with small silver stars. Silas wore a suit that Harper had helped him select, charcoal gray, that fit him well enough to suggest it had been tailored. He looked uncomfortable but determined, the way someone looks when entering spaces not built for them, but refusing to apologize for the intrusion. "You both look wonderful," Zola beamed. "Daddy says I look like a star." "You do." Elena knelt down, straightening one of the silver decorations that had gone slightly askew. "And you're going to shine tonight. I promise." The cocktail hour passed in conversation that Elena navigated on autopilot, making small talk with donors who wanted to discuss their contributions, board members who wanted to lobby for pet initiatives, nurses who wanted to share stories about patients. Catherine's training had helped them serve. She kept one eye on Silas and Zola, watching them move through the crowd with careful politeness, seeing how people's expressions shifted when they realized these two were employees' family rather than fellow donors. The microaggressions were subtle but present, a fractional pause before handshakes, questions asked, with the slight condescension people used when talking to those they assumed knew less, the invisible wall that separated the wealthier from everyone else, even at events supposedly dedicated to human dignity. Rebecca O.C. rescued them around 8, bringing Silas and Zola to meet several nurses who'd trained under Catherine. The conversation shifted immediately, warmth replacing stiffness, as the nurses learned about Grace's final months and Rena's role in making them bearable. Elena watched from across the terrace as Zola told the story of her science fair project, to an audience genuinely interested, saw how the child's anxiety dissolved when treated with respect rather than patronization. Harper appeared at Elena's elbow. Thomas isn't here yet. He's coming. He RSVP'd, yes. But he's making a point by arriving late. Let him make his point. This isn't about him. The program began at 8:30 with Elena's opening remarks. She'd written and rewritten the speech a dozen times, struggling to balance honoring Catherine's legacy with acknowledging the foundation's ongoing evolution. What emerged was something rawer than she'd planned: vulnerability that would have made her private equity colleagues uncomfortable, but felt necessary here. My mother, Catherine, believed that healthcare at its best was a combination of science and art, that you needed technical knowledge to address the body's failures, but you needed humanity to address the person's fears. She spent 40 years teaching nurses that medications matter, but presence matters more, that you can't always cure, but you can always care, that the difference between a good death and a terrifying one often comes down to whether someone bothered to really see the dying person as fully human until the end. The crowd was attentive, the kind of silence that meant people were actually listening rather than waiting for their turn to network. Elena let the pause extend, gathering herself for what came next. For the past decade, this foundation has trained nurses in that philosophy. We've been successful by traditional metrics: hundreds of graduates, thousands of patients, served quantifiable improvements in end-of-life care satisfaction. But this year, we've added something new. The Employee Family Support Program recognizes that we can't train others in compassion if we don't extend it to our own staff. That caring for others means caring for the people who work beside us every day. That dignity isn't something we reserve for patients. It's something we practice constantly or not at all. She gestured toward where Silas and Zola sat. Tonight, you're going to hear from Zola Reeve, whose father works night maintenance at my estate. Zola is 9 years old, brilliant in science, and recently won her school's science fair with a project about stellar echoes, how light from dead stars continues traveling through space long after the star itself is gone. Her mother died 5 years ago, cared for in her final months by a nurse trained in this room by Catherine Ashford. Zola's father took a job cleaning my floors because it allowed him to honor that connection while supporting his daughter. The scholarship we've provided Zola isn't charity. It's an acknowledgement that when we support the people who make our work possible, everyone rises. The applause felt genuine without the perfunctory quality that often marks such events. Elena stepped back and let Rebecca take over for the technical program, update the statistics about nurse training and patient outcomes that donors needed to justify their contributions. She found herself watching Zola instead, saw how the child sat very straight in her chair, hands folded in her lap, gathering courage for the moment when she'd have to stand before all these strangers and explain why dead stars mattered. Rena Holbrook spoke next. Her remarks focused on specific patients she'd cared for and what Catherine's teaching had given her to help them. She talked about a man dying of ALS who'd lost the ability to speak, but whose eyes could still communicate volumes if you paid attention. About a woman with terminal cancer who'd asked not for pain medication, but for someone to braid her hair the way her daughter used to before the estrangement that would never be repaired now. About a teenager shot in gang violence who died holding Rena's hand. No family present, just a stranger willing to make sure his last moments weren't spent alone. The stories were devastating and beautiful, and exactly what Catherine would have wanted shared. Several people in the audience were crying openly. Elena felt her own throat tighten, remembering her mother returning from hospital rounds with stories like these, the way Catherine would come home carrying other people's deaths and slowly set them down over dinner, or late-night tea, processing the weight of witnessing suffering you couldn't prevent, but could only make slightly more bearable. Then Rena said something that stopped Elena's breath entirely. The last time I spoke with Catherine was 3 weeks before she died. She called to check on a student I was mentoring, but the conversation turned personal. She said she was worried about her daughter, worried that Elena had learned the wrong lessons from watching her mother's career. That Elena might think caring meant martyring yourself to the work, burning out in service of others. Catherine said the thing she most wanted Elena to understand was that you can't pour from an empty cup, that sustainable compassion requires boundaries and self-care, and knowing when to stop watching and start living. The words landed like a physical blow. Elena stood frozen while the crowd applauded Rena's remarks, unable to process that her mother's final conversations had included worry about her. That Catherine had understood the cost of her choices and feared Elena would pay the same price. That the cameras and isolation and obsessive monitoring weren't honoring Catherine's legacy, but repeating her mistakes. Zola spoke last, her voice small but steady. She talked about her mother Grace, about missing her, but understanding that love doesn't end just because presence does. about how light from distant stars takes years to reach Earth, so astronomers see the past even while standing in the present. About how her father told her that love leaves echoes, and that echoes can guide you if you listen, instead of trying to see them. My mom died when I was 4. I don't remember her voice anymore, but Daddy tells me stories, and that's like hearing echoes. The scholarship from Ms. Ashford's foundation means I can keep learning about stars and echoes, and maybe someday teach other people that being gone isn't the same as being lost, that the light still travels even after the source disappears. The child finished and looked directly at her father, who nodded encouragement from the front row. The applause was thunderous, the kind that came from genuine emotion rather than social obligation. Elena found herself clapping until her hands ached watching this 9-year-old who'd survived her mother's death and her father's grief, and the casual cruelties of a world that judged people by job titles, who'd somehow emerged with enough hope to believe in stellar echoes and enduring love. After the formal program ended, guests moved toward the buffet and bar areas. Elena intended to circulate to make the rounds donors expected, but found herself cornered instead by Thomas Brennan. He'd arrived during Zola's remarks, standing at the back with an expression Elena couldn't read. That was quite a performance. Zola wasn't performing, she was telling him the truth packaged for maximum emotional impact. Thomas's tone carried contempt. You turned a fundraising gala into a referendum on your personal growth. That's not leadership, Elena. That's narcissism dressed as mission. The accusation stung because part of it was true. Elena had made this event partly about herself, about demonstrating that she'd changed, that she'd learned something Catherine had tried to teach. But underneath the performance was genuine conviction that the foundation needed to evolve beyond simply training nurses to actually embodying the values it claimed to champion. If caring about employees is narcissism, then I'm guilty. But I'd rather be guilty of that than guilty of treating human beings like interchangeable parts in a philanthropic machine. Your mother built that machine. You're dismantling it based on feelings rather than strategy. My mother died regretting that she'd built a machine at all. Rena just told you Catherine's final conversations were about how she'd gotten the balance wrong, how she'd sacrificed too much personal connection for professional achievement. I'm not dismantling her legacy. I'm correcting it. Thomas's face showed genuine anger, now the kind that came from deeply held beliefs being challenged. You've been director for 18 months. I worked with Catherine for 20 years. Don't presume to tell me what she would have wanted. Then why didn't you know she was worried about burning out? Why didn't you know she regretted the costs of her choices? Maybe 20 years of working beside someone isn't the same as actually seeing them. The conversation had crossed from professional disagreement into personal attack. Elena knew she should pull back, should de-escalate before damage became irreparable. But something in her had shifted over the past months, some capacity for accepting performance over truth that the cameras had finally burned away. Thomas, if you can't support what this foundation is becoming, then maybe it's time for you to leave the board. I appreciate everything you did with my mother, but I'm not her and I'm done pretending I should be. Thomas stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked toward the exit without another word. Elena watched him go, feeling simultaneously liberated and terrified. She'd just forced out the board member with the longest tenure, the person who represented institutional memory and donor relationships that predated her involvement. The foundation would survive. She'd made sure of that with endowment structure, but she'd created an enemy with decades of connections in the narrative that she was a grieving daughter, destroying her mother's legacy. Harper materialized at her side. That looked intense. I think I just lost a board member. Thomas was never going to accept the direction you are taking. Better to part ways cleanly than have him sabotaged from within. Will other board members follow him? Maybe 2. Rebecca will stay and she'll bring most of the others with her. You'll rebuild. The confidence in Harper's voice was steadying. Elena took a breath and turned back toward the party where Silas and Zola were being surrounded by nurses eager to hear more about Grace's final months in Rena's care. The scene was everything Elena had wanted: genuine connection across class boundaries, people seeing each other as fully human, rather than donors and recipients, the mission being lived rather than merely discussed. She made her way through the crowd, accepting congratulations on the program, deflecting questions about Thomas's abrupt departure, gradually working toward where Silas stood talking with Rena. When she finally reached them, the two were deep in conversation about Grace's final days, about what Rena remembered, and what Silas had never known, because some moments happened when he'd left the room to call family or simply stood in the hallway crying. I didn't know she asked you to sing to her. Silas's voice carried wonder and pain intertwined. Grace always said she couldn't carry a tune. She asked me to sing Amazing Grace the night before she died. Rena's eyes were wet, said she wanted to hear her name in a context that wasn't about sickness. I sang it 3 times and she smiled each time like it was the first. Elena felt like an intruder on private grief, but Rena noticed her and gestured her into the circle. You did something important tonight. Catherine would have loved it. Would she? Or would she think I was being self-indulgent? Both, probably. Rena's smile was gentle. Catherine contained multitudes. She could hold space for contradiction. You're allowed to do the same. The party continued until nearly midnight, guests lingering over drinks and conversation, reluctant to leave the rare combination of beauty and genuine human connection. Elena moved through it all with the surreal sensation of watching herself from outside her body, seeing how she interacted with people without the mediation of cameras or the protection of isolation. It felt exposing and exhilarating, simultaneously, like learning to swim by being thrown into deep water. Silas and Zola left around 11, the child fighting exhaustion but glowing with pride over how her speech had been received. Elena walked them to their car, a gesture that probably seemed ordinary to them, but felt monumental to her. The billionaire escort, the acknowledgement that they mattered beyond their utility. Thank you for tonight. Silas spoke quietly, Zola already drowsing in the back seat. For all of it. The scholarship, the gala treating Zola like she belonged there. She did belong there. More than half the donors, honestly. You've changed since I started working here. His observation carried no judgment, just recognition. You seem less afraid. I am less afraid. Still terrified, but less. Elena surprised herself with the honesty. You taught me that watching isn't the same as seeing, that cameras show you everything except what matters. What matters? Presence. Trust. The risk of actually knowing people instead of just monitoring them. Silas nodded slowly. Love leaves echoes, Ms. Ashford. But you have to stop looking at recordings to hear them. He drove away, taillights disappearing down the long driveway, and Elena stood alone on her estate, feeling less alone than she had in 18 months. The last guest departed over the next hour, Harper overseeing final logistics, while Elena retreated to the library to decompress. She'd removed the cameras from this room weeks ago, trusting that some spaces needed to exist outside surveillance, that the house could have zones of true privacy without the world ending. Harper found her there near 1 a.m., both of them exhausted from the evening, but too wired to sleep. That was extraordinary. The program, the speeches, everything. You should be proud. I fired Thomas. I know. I saw. Harper sat down across from her, kicked off the heels she'd been wearing for 6 hours. He deserved it. Did he, or did I just remove someone who challenged me? He called you narcissistic for caring about employees' families. That's not challenge, that's cruelty, disguised as principle. Elena wasn't sure she agreed, but lacked the energy to argue. What happens now? Now you keep going, you wake up tomorrow and do the work again. That's all leadership, is showing up consistently even when it's hard. She returned to her bedroom around 2 a.m. and stood looking at the empty space where monitors had been removed weeks before. The room felt larger without them, less like a command center and more like a place where someone actually lived. 17 cameras remained operational throughout the estate, but Elena hadn't checked their feeds in days. The muscle memory of surveillance still pulled at her, sometimes the urge to verify and confirm and watch, but she'd learned to recognize the impulse for what it was, fear disguised as diligence, control masquerading as care. Elena fell asleep that night, understanding that grief would remain, that the loss of Catherine was permanent, that no amount of cameras or programs or redemptive gestures would bring her mother back. But alongside the grief sat something new, the knowledge that presence could replace surveillance. That connection required vulnerability, that love really did leave echoes if you stopped recording long enough to listen for them.